I'm an attorney. I practiced securities litigation in New York for a long time. I also ran several businesses, so doing this kind of work wasn't on the radar. I got into the field of for psychic, well, actually, first psychotherapy, then psychic, then paranormal, and then extraterrestrial. So it's been a long progression for me. And I trained for about 10 years as a psychic detective with a well known psychic detective. She's appeared a lot on television. Her name is Nancy Orlin Weber. And the you might appreciate the way that I met her. She appeared on some TV show, and so I thought, and she was a registered nurse, an RN, and very, very down to earth, and I liked her. And I thought, well, gee, here's somebody who can speak clearly and logically, matter of factly about psychic abilities. So I wanted to get in touch with her because I was working on my book. And so I called up the TV station. I said, I'd like to get in touch with this woman. Can you give me her email address? So they gave me her email. I get in touch and I say, listen, I would love to interview you, to meet you, and I'm willing to travel anywhere in the United States. I don't know where you are. Would you be open to that? And she said, well, what state are you in? And at the time I was in New Jersey. So I said, New Jersey. And she said, oh, okay, what town? I said, well, it's very small. It's only 3 square miles wide. Nobody's ever heard of it. She said, what town? And I said, well, it's called Mountain Lakes. And so she said, okay, I'll meet you at the XYZ, whatever it was, cafe. Turns out she and I lived 5 minutes from each other. And so that launched my training essentially into becoming a psychic detective. And initially I said, I'm not psychic. I don't have any of these skills or abilities. So I'm just going to take notes. I'm just going to, watch you and your students. And she said, no, you're not allowed. You have to participate. So very, very reluctantly, I did. And what I learned was that, and this was surprising to me too, that when you're doing psychic detective work, you have to be trained in a whole lot of psychic skills that don't seem at first like they're related. So you're doing things like, you're learning how to read auras or different types of predictions or telepathic communications or psychometry or, you name it. And somehow they're all related to this kind of work. Yeah.
So tell me more about these skills, and maybe it would be interesting if you could explain it to us by means of an example. So how do these skills come in when you're working on a case, for instance?
Okay. So the kind of, well, let me preface this also in that most psychics do not want to go into this kind of work because just as if you were like a homicide detective going out and going to the scene of the crime, that's what you're doing with your mind, your consciousness. And a lot of times you're there in a very strong sense of the word. You experience what the victims felt. You sometimes will experience the emotions of the perpetrators. You're going to see often grisly kinds of things. A lot of psychics don't want to do that. They're going to go more into, giving typical sorts of psychic readings for people or something that's maybe nicer. Okay. But the way that I always looked at this kind of work is it's a service, and it's a service to not just the families of the victims, but also the victims on the other side. So an example. Normally, what I worked on were homicides, sometimes missing persons, missing objects, missing pets, animals, stuff like that. But usually it was homicides. And there are some that have really stuck out in my mind. Particularly, I would say one of the ones was this was a homicide of a young girl, and she had been essentially, raped, murdered, and then her body hidden. And so all of those things come into your consciousness like you're there. And, you see that moment of death because you have to be there in order to understand who did it or what happened. And so for me, the perpetrator was there, and I got a good look at him. Sometimes I'm able to draw sketches. Sometimes I'm able to give people's names. Not always. But what happened was really peculiar in that particular case, because normally I'm connecting with the spirit of the victim. And in this case, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I felt myself my consciousness sort of being sucked into the consciousness of this perpetrator. And it's just a vile feeling. It's absolutely disgusting. And, psychics always say, well, have you protected yourself? You surrounded yourself with white light and all that kind of stuff. I'm normally not big on ritual. I believe that the power of your own consciousness and your belief in yourself is what protects you from everything. So that's how I tend to operate. That particular case, I know that I did all kinds of sort of kind of ritual cleansings of my consciousness after that. You just wanted to take a bath. You want to take a bath until you scrubbed and shredded everything off of you. But I still think about that. I have some chills now thinking about that. And that only happened a couple of times in my experience. And yeah, you just have to be careful when you're working in these realms.
When you say you have to be careful, what do you have to be careful of?
I'm a believer in, however you want to call this, I'm a believer in good and in evil. I'm a believer in angels and demons, in positive and negative. And I do believe that because of these dualities, there, I don't know if you want to call it wars that go on. There are interactions. And you have to perceive yourself in a particular way in order to be a formidable warrior, okay? And I don't just rely on myself. And what I tell all of my students is, if you're going to go into this field, you must know your spiritual allies. And that's very, very strong, because we're both physical and non-physical beings. And when you're entering into this kind of realm of consciousness, it's non-physical for the most part. So you need to be, we're good. And if you're strong, that's even better. But if you know who your non-physical, in other words, your spiritual allies are, and I don't think it makes a difference whether you're dealing with, God, prophets, angels, dear departed family members or friends, whoever they are, they're in the non-physical, the spiritual realm. And you can call on them, and they not only help to protect you, and I'm speaking now as somebody who does mediumship, But they also, I believe, can do battle on your behalf if necessary. And I think that's really important for people to understand.
Definitely. I think that's something that is not talked about enough because there's always reversals of the coin, and we talk about the positive experiences, but we also need to be wary that not every experience will be positive. But I also, one of the things that I found interesting about the story you shared was you mentioned you are able to tap into the scene of the crime by feeling what the victim felt, but also by feeling what the perpetrator felt. So, are you then able to tap into that mindset, essentially those thoughts, and how do you not take, because that seems like a very dense, like a very negative energy, especially when you go into the mindset of somebody who is able to do a crime.
Mm-hmm.
How are you able to tap into to be able to solve a case and then tap out of, and you don't let those thoughts sort of wash over you? Because I'm sure that even people with bad intentions, right, they don't think they have bad intentions, they see the reason for what they're doing, they see the logic of it. So could you speak about that topic of tapping into that reality of a murderer, or of somebody who has committed crime? And also, I would be very interested to know, how do you protect your mental health and yourself
Mm-hmm.
from
I have,
keeping separate?
I think I have an advantage in that regard, and probably over a lot of like natural psychics, because as I actually mentioned to you earlier, I'm very analytical. I'm very intellectual. So for me, if I'm going into, I'm allowing my consciousness to travel, to tap into sometimes a homicide or whatever. I am. I'm not getting emotionally overwhelmed by being at the scene of the crime, or being somehow connected with the consciousness of the victim or the perpetrator. I don't get overwhelmed by it. It's because I'm looking at it like it's a puzzle. It's an intellectual thing. Oh, I have to solve this. What piece would fit here? What psychological piece? And I'm also an attorney. So what piece of evidence? What type of an argument can be made here? What's the lay of the land? Who are some of the other people? If they're witnesses, who are they? What's their piece to add to this puzzle? So that protects me. And it protects me from getting really sucked into sort of the deep emotions of doing this kind of work. The other thing I wanted to say was that, you said, you were asking me, I don't remember the exact question, but you were asking about, well, if you're connecting with either the perpetrator's consciousness or the victim's consciousness, how do you balance them out, or how do you deal with those? And I wanted to say that there's another degree, or I don't even know how you say this. It's a way of connecting into a situation, which is your own consciousness. So, well, let me give you an example. And this was one of the very first. It wasn't even really a case. It was one of the first things I ever did when I started working on psychic detective cases. I had a friend who said that one of her coworkers had gone missing for, I don't know, a few days, and was out of touch, and they couldn't reach this person by his cell phone. He seemed, I think, a little distraught over his love life, and she thought, and I think he'd gone off with, he was a hunter, so he'd gone off with one of his guns to do some hunting in the woods, and they hadn't heard from him since. very long story short, I tried to tune into him. Okay. I began having very labored breathing, and I didn't know why. And I thought, well, maybe it's because I'm not used to doing this kind of work and it's sort of scary. And I thought, well, no, this breathing thing doesn't really feel like me. Because I don't really have any, I don't think it would be me. And then I thought, okay, well, if it's not me, then it must be the spirit of this guy who's gone missing, and he's maybe wants to show me where he is. Long story short, I felt like my consciousness zoomed, I would say maybe 30 feet off the ground. Okay, almost like one of those really tall movie cranes. Okay, and that I was looking down, or I'm sort of like a drone these days, I guess. And I was looking down at a car, and I had the color of the car, and I said to myself, and it's in a parking lot. I said, I don't know if I really want to take a real good look at this, but I think I have to, because that's my job. I owe it to my friend. So my consciousness, which now doesn't belong to the victim, doesn't belong to a perpetrator, my consciousness goes down right about just slightly above window level of the car, looks in, and I see that he has essentially, he has his gun there, and he shot himself in the head, and it's a big mess. And of course, I didn't want to stay there because I didn't want to look at it. It was pretty awful. And so I had to get back on, eventually call my friend, and I didn't want to say that I felt that he was gone, but I felt obligated. And I felt bad because when you're doing this work, particularly in the beginning, and this was just the beginning of when I was starting, you don't know. I mean, you think, or at least I did, oh, it's just my imagination. How do you know the difference between your imagination and your psychic awareness? Which one is true? And we grow up being taught that your imagination is just that, crazy subjective fantasy stuff that has no real interaction with reality. And I've learned that's completely wrong. It does. At any rate, I called up my friend and I said, I'm really sorry. This is what I saw. And she said, okay, well, I'll let you know if I hear anything. I think about a few weeks later, she emailed me. She said everything I had said was 100% accurate. In the color of the car, the manner of the death, the parking lot, the whole business. And the only thing that bothered me was that I had seen this parking lot in a very peculiar shape. And it's sort of, because I was trying to find, well, where is he? Where's his body if he's gone? So I can help these people. Because really, that's the whole point of the whole thing. And the parking lot sort of, it looked like the state of Texas. So I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't think he's gone to Texas. I'm just not feeling that at all. He was in New Jersey. And I looked, I actually Googled on a bunch of maps in New Jersey. I looked at the shape of different parks or wooded areas or shopping mall shapes or anything. And I couldn't find anything. So I felt bad about that. I felt terrible. And eventually I told another psychic detective friend of mine what I had seen and that I just couldn't figure that out. And she said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. That's the shape of Morris County," which, by the way, is where I lived in New Jersey. It's almost identical in many ways to the shape of the state of Texas. Sure enough, that's where they found him. That's where the parking lot was. So even though you go into these very kind of sort of creepy places in your mind, or in your consciousness, I guess, ultimately what you're doing is you're being of service to people. You're helping people.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I can imagine that you bring so much peace and relief to people and the information that they need. It's amazing that you're able to do the kind of work that you do. I want to ask you about free will, because a lot of your work is tapping into those scenes, tapping into those emotions, and figuring out what had happened. Does that imply, especially when you're tapping into the consciousness of somebody else, be it the victim or the perpetrator, what I understand is that we have free will, right? So that you could, for instance, try to tap into my consciousness, but if I do not allow it or do not want to, that wouldn't be possible. Is how does that work? Is it usually the victim that allows that, or is it no such thing as?
Okay, well, so that gets me into a whole other topic. I'm what's called a remote viewer. So I'm trained in different types of remote viewing, such as controlled remote viewing, associative remote viewing, extended remote viewing, and I have created over the last decade a different type of remote viewing that I call TSP, and I teach this. And so that's actually, your question has been raised for decades. My mentor was the guy who essentially created remote viewing back in 1972, 73. And so people have always asked in remote viewing, because we all know that consciousness can travel and that you can locate remote information. That's what remote viewing means. It's a type of perception that can go beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. And you can go forwards and backwards. You can go to the other side of the earth. You can go to the inside of the earth. You can go to Mars, whatever. And you can allow your, let's say, imagination to pick up data. You then hopefully have a means of getting some feedback on at least some of it to verify, how accurate you are. It was developed initially for the CIA, and then for the military and some other intelligence agencies. And they in a program, it was called Stargate. And so one of the big questions, of course, is, if the other guys are doing the same thing, how do you shield your own consciousness? And so that's been a topic of a lot of discussion among remote viewers. And I think there are some ways that can be done. And this is just my personal opinion, I don't know that you can, just because you don't want somebody to pick up information about you, doesn't mean you're going to be able to stop them from doing it necessarily. I think there's certain techniques that need to be used to do that. And since I give readings to people, and I've done that for decades, and I have clients who sometimes you get both extremes. You get people who are extreme believers and they want to believe everything you say, and I tell them not to, because I don't know. Some stuff it's a matter of interpretation of your psychic imagery, and sometimes interpretations are not right. So I don't want people to trust me too much. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who will come to you strictly because they want to test you. And so there's an arrogance and an uncooperative aspect of that as well. Sometimes even trickery if they're giving you false information. But I know that in either case and all along the spectrum, you have an ability to tap into their consciousness and to get accurate information. So that, to me, when you're asking about free will, I mean, I've been in a whole lot of conversations about free will with scientists recently. I think, I mean, it's not really a question of free will. It's a question of something else.
Right, right. I think that's such a fascinating topic, the way you mention it, because definitely I think we're all connected, and that idea seems to be coming back and be more powerful than ever nowadays, and science has come a long way and is backing that up more and more.
Yeah.
So the idea that we're all connected and we're one and we're not as divided as we see through our senses, that you're you and I'm me, there wouldn't be, right, my free will and your free will, because there would be. So it's definitely very interesting to talk about this. And I think also the other part is that we all think that our thoughts and feelings are just something very intimate. And sometimes you are in a situation, like for instance in therapy or in your work, where you want to share that because you need help that you cannot offer yourself. But in other cases, for instance, when you've done something that you're ashamed of, or you've done something bad, you would probably, want to block that access. You wouldn't want people to be able to tap in. But the fact that that's still a possibility, that's really interesting.
I actually, I wrote about that in my book, Psychic Intuition. And I said, it's funny. Everybody thinks exactly what you said, which is, we have these little secrets that, we can keep them all secret from everybody else and nobody will ever know. Well, I said, what's funny is that I think most people just don't realize that our thoughts, we live in a fishbowl. Our thoughts are visible. And if you really want to make sure that nobody thinks poorly of you because of something you've done, you're ashamed of, or something bad or whatever, the idea is to be as honest and truthful and forthright about it as possible and not to do it. Be the person that, the shamed part of you wants to be. And that's the best way to make sure that your thoughts, when they are seen, experienced, or read by somebody, are going to be, what you want them to be. Everybody wears a mask and they think the mask covers them, and no, it doesn't.
That's really true. And one of the things I've been struggling with for a long time is that I would pick up inconsistencies. So I would pick up inconsistencies in people's stories. And I did not know that that's what I was picking up on, but I would know, somebody would say something completely unrelated to me, just a random story about their holiday. And for some reason, I would be annoyed of hearing that piece of information because it just didn't ring true. And there was probably like a lie that they weren't even trying to lie to me, but they were probably lying to themselves. And I've come to understand that that's sort of my intuition telling, or my inner self sort of picking up that inconsistency in somebody's story. And sometimes it is helpful if I need to be careful with somebody. But other times, if you want to tell me you've had a lovely holiday and in fact you didn't, but you just want to make it seem like you had, it's just not that helpful. It's just that it will trigger something in me. But also what I have been reading and what I know from the science background is that as humans, generally, we're very bad at spotting a lie. So we tend to believe feelings, we tend to believe a good story. So just think of, those random scams and marketing and all of those things, that if you say granola bar is healthy, right, we'll be like, oh, like this is so healthy, healthier than an apple, because look, it has more vitamins in it. So where do you stand on this whole humans being able to pick up lies?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Okay, so, well, first of all, because of what I do, I have to explain that for for probably decades now, I watch all of those shows on TV about, unsolved murders and that kind of thing. And then I make little judgments or calls along the way, like, oh yeah, that guy did it, or no, 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 that one's lying, that one's innocent, whatever. So I have been checking my own capacities to do that for a long time. And the more you do it, you start to see, you can hear the most, the subtle things, like the timbre of the voice, or little quavers in the voice, or the slightest little turn of a head, or, I mean, classic body language stuff, like somebody when they're talking and they're telling you something really important and they just can't, there's just a tick, like a poker thing. I interviewed poker players quite a while back, because they're excellent lie detector people. And that's why they're all wearing baseball caps and sunglasses when they're playing poker, and they're trying not to play with their chips. But you can tell when somebody's lying. And I think there's one exception, and I was always really ashamed of this. When my daughter was young, we were living in Manhattan, and she had a nanny who spoke French, because my husband's family is French, and she moved in with us, and we had a large apartment, and she took my daughter to her school every day, took care of her, and she seemed almost too good to be true. She cooked for us. She was folding my daughter's, laundry, the stuff on the floor. She was, I mean, fantastic. Could not have been better. And she was extremely smart. At my daughter's, I forget which birthday party it was, there were a lot of her little friends in the apartment and their moms. Their moms all put their pocketbooks and their purses and things in the bedroom to keep them away. And at the very end of it, one of my good friends who had the same age daughter, she said, I can't find my pocketbook. And we looked everywhere in the apartment, couldn't find it. And so they left. Very, very long story short, I had never gone into this nanny's, we gave her a bedroom, never gone in there before, but I had my husband keep her occupied. And I went in and I discovered, it was like walking into the mind of a crazy person. All of the things that I had been missing, including, my favorite coffee mugs, my underwear, which was all thrown together with newspapers and things under her bed. In her closet was a pile of pocketbooks and purses that weren't mine. Didn't belong to anybody I knew. They were piled up maybe 5 feet tall. She had documents and records of her former employer. I looked under her mattress and I found my friend's disconnected phone with the battery taken apart. I then discovered she had stolen all of my jewelry. And so we set up a sting operation and we caught her. And of course, she fought tooth and nail. She went, pleaded with us. Oh, please don't put me in jail. I'll show you where all your stuff is. We'll do that. We'll do this. She had an accomplice also, and they were due to leave the country the next day. And she was very sincere. She'd read me tarot cards, saying, whoever stole your jewelry, it's a very bad woman that you work with. Okay. my point of telling you this entire story, and by the way, she had stolen from every play date she ever went to, all of my neighbors, she'd stolen things from her previous employers. She was wanted in France. She was a jewelry thief. And she was working with a ring. What I learned was, and I was mad at myself because I said to myself, this is what I'm supposed to be good at. Why didn't I see any of the signs? There were signs there, but I attributed them to good qualities as opposed to bad qualities. So what was wrong? And I realized, I think there's one exception to not being able to detect lies in people. It's when the person is a sociopath, because they themselves, inside their own consciousness, don't see it as being wrong. So I think that's the only exception. Other than that, I think I'm a pretty good detector of when people are telling me the truth or not.
That's, wow, such an impressive story. And Jesus, just thinking of the fact that she was in your house, she was with your daughter. But what intrigues me is, you've mentioned, so of course she was stealing jewelry, that was the end game, but you also mentioned finding objects like mugs or like your underwear. Now, what was the point of those objects, or why would she be hoarding that? Is that just a different personality, a different kind of person that's weird, or is there a purpose to that?
What I assembled in my own rationale for that, she had also stolen the personal photo albums of her previous employers. And she was telling me, oh, there's my family, there's my sister. And I remember saying to her, oh, that's funny, you don't look at all like your sister. And I had this faintest sense that she flinched when I said that, but I didn't know why. It's because it wasn't her family. She had stolen, I found piles of engagement rings and wedding rings belonging to I don't know who, including I found some that belonged to her previous employer. She had stolen their tax records. She had stolen, so my theory on her taking my personal things was that in her delusion, she wanted to be me. And I think she grew up in a not very happy circumstance and was adopted, one of many, I don't know how many, over 10 children who were adopted by a French couple who were just collecting the equivalent of sort of Social Security for each kid. So I think she didn't know who she was. And each one of these was an effort to try on somebody else's life.
Right. So a bit of a personality disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So what I also wanted to get into is, how does, especially because you come from the side of the law, so very rigorous, not scientific, but very rigorous training, and then the work that you do now that's on the other side, that has skepticism and people believing or not believing it seems like two opposite worlds. But as you're proving it, especially having the law background and being able to tap into consciousness and solve these puzzles, is extremely beneficial. So you've also mentioned the military and the CIA and other intelligence agencies using remote viewing and other methods to be able to acquire information, which I think is really useful. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, how does what you do hold in a court of law, and how is it seen in, especially nowadays. What I want to get into as well is, if we think of the political situation, now I don't want to get too into it, but there's different fights going on, and there's a lot of division. Let's say it like that, so that we're politically correct. And I can imagine for every intelligence agency, any kind of edge that you can get and any kind of information that you can get is very useful. But somehow, in our normal world, or what we perceive to be society nowadays, we see things like consciousness or psychics. We see it like woo woo, people that you go into a basement and they have that glass bowl, and they just basically take away all of your money and read your palm. So how do these two worlds marry, and how does what you do, how can it add a benefit to the information that we need to be able to solve cases in court, but to also be able to solve bigger division problems in our world today? It was a very long-winded question, but
Right.
I'm sure you
Okay.
got the gist of it.
Yeah, that is hard. Okay, so let me break that down a little bit. So the first thing is that I think you asked is, can you use this kind of information in a court of law? And I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, and I did used to look at that quite a bit. And I knew some psychics who were, they were called as witnesses and whatever, and delivered their psychic sensing. All right, that does not fly in a court of law. I think I maybe found one case, but it was small and it was very dependent, fact dependent. So I don't think you could apply it in a whole lot of cases where they let in some of the psychic information, but only because, as I recall, there was additional evidence that could back up at least part of it. Other than that, you're really, and that's why I said feedback is essential. You've got to get some kind of feedback on whatever your psychic information is that you're delivering to somebody. Otherwise, there's no way to know if it's just your imagination, something you made up. I'm an incredibly creative person. I mean, I know I could make up anything I want to because I'm very artistic and I'm very creative. So I can't do that. I have to seek feedback always, and that's your evidence. And evidence allows you to that can be produced in court, in a lawsuit, and that's difficult, and that's sort of after the fact, and it's ancillary to the psychic data that you're producing. Just because you have the ability, let's say, to read minds or to make accurate predictions doesn't mean you can always do it. This is not even, for example, with the best remote viewers, you're still looking at, maybe as an average best, somewhere maybe around, 80, 84% accuracy. And as I said, a lot of the problem is in interpretation of your psychic imagery. And you can interpret it all wrong. People, that happens all the time. How is it going to solve problems? If I have to remember your question now.
Yeah, so I was also thinking in terms of intelligence agencies that are constantly looking to have an edge on other intelligence agencies, essentially, in the topic of international relations. Are they working on any kind of, psychic skills or with that?
Well, first of all, you'd have to ask them. But there's so many declassified documents at this point that confirm. I mean, that was the entire reason why remote viewing was developed in the first place. It's because there was a book that came out, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. It came out, I don't know, around 1970 or so. And basically it was written by these two women who had learned a tremendous amount about what was being done in the former Soviet Union in terms of research into parapsychology. and they were, and Eastern Bloc countries as well. They were very, very far advanced. And because Americans, I mean, Americans are just kind of, they're all the practical people, the entrepreneurs, the ones who deal with, meat and potatoes kinds of stuff. They don't believe in that woo-woo stuff. So getting Americans to even indulge in any kind of research on paranormal or parapsychological topics was not happening, not back then. And so they created the remote viewing program to suddenly try to play catch up with what was going on in the Soviet Union. But it's very well known that US and, for example, Russian and other intelligence agencies are very, very interested in these topics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I always think that for every 1% of information that you get as a general public, there's, a lot more where that came from that is, of course, not accessible to us, which also makes a lot of sense in the line of work that they do.
Yeah.
Nancy, I know that we want to talk about aliens as well, but I feel like we've gotten so into this topic that I wouldn't want to dilute it. But the question that I want to end with is there something that people never think to ask you, but that you think it's really important for us to know or for you to share?
Oh gosh, I mean, I could go off in about a million different directions on that one. I think the most important well, let me put it this way. I've been working with scientists on several of these things for a while. Specifically, I was working on psychokinesis, which is the ability to move objects with your mind, which is something that I can do. And I went to Russia also to learn how they did it. That's a whole other long story. But in dealing with scientists, and I'm talking about these are international scientists, and some of the top scientists really grappling with the issues of consciousness and what is it, and how do we define it scientifically, and that kind of stuff. What they need to understand, and I'm sorry, I keep interrupting myself on this. What they need to understand is that the way that they or a person thinks about life will determine what degree of consciousness they will be exposed to. And within that ability to have consciousness or awareness or experience of certain things in life, both physical and non-physical. I really mean both. You have to change the way you think. And that doesn't mean you go into this kind of fuzzy, wishful thinking, gee whiz, if only I could fantasize about whatever. No, it's not that at all. I have an article that's actually just been accepted for publication in a scientific journal that explains what I'm talking about. It has to do with, and I call these styles of thinking. And depending on which style of thinking you engage in, you're only going to be aware of certain aspects of our physical and non-physical environment. And everything else will be invisible. It does not exist for you. That's why you have to start at the starting place, which is, what style of thinking are you engaging in? How's it affecting your entire experience of life? And once you figure that out, you will start to experience some very, very unusual things.
So, if I understand correctly, your description of styles of thinking, this would mean that if, for instance, somebody were to not believe in the paranormal or psychics in any of this, that would just not be available to them. Nothing outside of the regular would be, right?
That's a well-known fact. Yes.
There we go.
And go ahead. I'm
But
sorry.
then as long as the more open we are, then I'm interested in, you're closed off, you're closed to experience what Joe Dispenza calls three-dimensional reality. Say you're open, what levels are there? What styles of thinking are there?
What I have proposed as a theory, okay, is 3 different styles. And I have each one of those styles has a personality type that has 2 of those styles of thinking. And the personality types, the way I've described them, are what they call neurotypical, psychic, and neurodivergent. And each one of those personalities thinks differently using a couple of different thinking styles of those other, so it's a pair of each of the thinking styles. And it will very much determine, what you're able to see in life or experience. Skepticism is a result of a certain style of thinking. And I know this because I spent pretty much like the first half of my life, at least, not believing in any of this. And I had no unusual experiences, or maybe a couple, but that was it. They didn't exist for me. And so I understand very well why they don't exist for people like scientists who are taught and trained to be skeptical. That's their job. And also for other people who are just naturally suspicious or skeptical if it doesn't already exist in their own prior experience.
And it makes a lot of sense. And I love that, there's always a debate, and I see it in the comments as well, between do you believe or do you not believe, and you're right or you're wrong. But what you're telling us is it's actually way more nuanced. And if you have a certain thinking style, then it will not be true for you, but it might be true for somebody else. And one of the concepts that I've been playing with over the past, I think, months or years has been, I don't think that there is one objective truth, but I think everybody has their own truth. And I think as long as there's space for everybody to share, which is why I've also started this podcast, to share their stories and their truth, and their lessons, I think that's the best we can do. And somebody's truth does not depend on other people accepting it or not. So I think very much nowadays, if you open the TV, you'll see duality, right? Like if they're wrong about this, or if they're right, or they shouldn't do this, or they should, or wrong and right. But things are not as black and white. I think everybody can have their own truth. You can choose not to believe somebody else's truth. But it doesn't make it less true just because you don't subscribe to it. And it's the same, I think, for these experiences and for NDEs, for instance. There can be people that say, it was just a hallucination, or it was medication. And sure, you can choose not to believe that. That's fine. It doesn't mean that that person needs to change their understanding of their story. And I think that would be a much more compassionate world if we would look at facts that way.
I agree with you. We're living in unbelievably combative binary terms of, if you don't believe me, or if you're not with us, you're against us. And that's just all wrong, and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, everything is incredibly nuanced, which is why people are not stupid. People can understand things. They just sometimes need to have certain things explained in their language. And once you can tap into somebody's, what I call language, usually you can reach them because people by and large are not stupid.
Yeah, exactly. That's very, very true. But I do think that a lot of times because there's a lot of aggression, because there's a lot of fear-based messaging, I feel like that sort of taps into certain areas of our brains and certain frequencies, that we tend to miss the information or the reality. And one of the small examples that I give is in my country, nobody understands inflation and what it actually is. So whenever there's a political party that says, well, we'll give you, a kilo of sugar, or a pound of sugar, probably in the US,
Right.
they'll vote for them, or they'll say there's a candidate now that says we'll make houses cheaper. But how can you do that? Because you don't necessarily need a master's degree, but how would you work through that? And I think people see that as a campaign and they say, yes, because I don't have enough money to afford a house at the current prices. So awesome, you're going to make it at 10% of the price. Awesome, I'll vote for you. But the minute you get out of that, is it good or is it bad? You can go into, but hold on, how are you going to make that happen for me? Wouldn't it actually be better if you brought us all to an income level where we could afford the current prices of the houses? And maybe that's not necessarily better, but what would be the thinking for one and what would be the thinking for the other one? And I think if that was laid down properly and if there was interest in discovering that, I think people would come a long way in having informed opinions, rather than just having this fear-based messaging when you're like, yes, I'll go for that person, and just decide in a split second.
I'm old enough to have seen all of the various, well, most of them, the electronic revolutions on things. And what I do know is, and I think it's created the situation you're talking about, which is sound bites. It started with, television and advertising when everything was a motto or a phrase, and it's been reduced with the internet and with everything subsequent into memes, which are even more abrasive and aggressive in there because they're so short. So nobody is engaging in extended thinking the way you're talking about. They simply, they're going to buy in to one point of view or the other without really thinking it through, because we're not really doing that much anymore, which is a shame.
Yeah. And my biggest concern is, and that's just a thought, is definitely not backed up by anything I've read, but we think of muscles, or like the muscles in your body, or the bones, as something that you have to work out. So imagine if somebody's sick and they're just lying in bed for months, like their muscle structure, their bone structure just degrades to a point where then they can walk then, and they're not really able to do what they were able to do before. What if that was the case for thinking? So what if you are always looking for those quick fixes and those short kind of informations and those pre-made opinions that you just automatically subscribe to? And what if going for the easy way and not putting in any work as to form your own opinions, what if that sort of degrades our own intelligence and IQ and power of thinking? And that's just a thought. I'm not saying it is the case, but I could see that happening.
I have been complaining for many years about the fact that there's a great movie. I think it's great. It's sort of like one of these sort of cult classic types. It's called the Idiocracy. And planet Earth, everybody becomes so stupid that they're starving. And people from the past travel into the future, and they find out that the problem is that these people can't seem to grow crops. Why? Because they say, but we're watering them with sports drinks. And so the people from the past say, hey, listen, try water. And once they water them and their crops and the people are happy and they're fed, they make the people from the past presidents. that's where we're headed. And by the way, you're not off base with the issue of, is it causing stupidity and other mental issues? It is. They're just starting to come out with studies now that are showing that a lot of this, particularly younger, kids and young adults and stuff who were constantly on social media, they have significantly higher rates of ADHD and different sort of autistic spectrum disorders. They can't focus. So how can you think if you can't focus?
Yeah.
And by the way, I believe that's part of the goal here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely something. It's always much easier, right? Though I have to say, one quote from the Bible always comes to mind, because I tend to be an overthinker and a critical thinker. And there's a quote in the Bible, I'll probably misquote it in English, but it says, not as stupid as people, but certainly people that don't think a lot, they tend to be the happiest. And I can see that being true, about being more content the less you think or overanalyze. And this is definitely not, because I need to be careful with having an audience that will listen to this as well. This is not a case for like, don't think and don't use your brain, but it's also the case of like, we can have a small conflict and then we'll overanalyze everything and it will stay with us for weeks and months. And sometimes that's just not in the best interest of your health and your brain to do that. So just writing it off and moving on is better. But you do need a sound logic for when it's the case of just dropping it and moving on, and when it's the case to actually use your critical thinking skills.
Yeah, I think the equivalent expression in English is ignorance is bliss.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, it's here, so my brain just tends to slower.
Yeah. But I also, listen, I agree with you, but I do think if people focus on simply trying to make sure that they're always curious, curiosity is the highest sign of intelligence.
Yeah.
And just be curious. You don't have to come out one side or the other. Just kind of want to know more about whatever it is instead of accepting.
Yeah. No, that's such a good lesson. And that's that definitely is a great thing that I think we can all learn from today and apply into our own lives. So just look at things with more curiosity as opposed to black and white or agreeing or disagreeing with them. That sort of binary way. Well, Nancy, it's been so fascinating to understand more about what you do and how you are of service in the world. And I could not imagine being able to do what you do, but I'm so happy that you and people like you exist to solve these complex puzzles that wouldn't have a solution otherwise. Now, tell me, how can people find you and your work? And I know that you have a few books, 3, if I'm not mistaken. How can we find them?
The books, they're all on different topics, like very different. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I actually co-wrote a book with a retired New York City homicide detective. So that's out there. They're all on Amazon. And in terms of getting in touch with me, I am known as the Skeptical Psychic. So my website is theskepticalpsychic.com. And people can get in touch with me. I have different categories and I deal with a number of things that we didn't even get to. So anything unusual, I'm very open to, work with people on. And I do teach. So